Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you for this QAA conference. I'm particularly excited by the theme we have today and the discussions ahead. The keynote address this morning begins with the question, is embedded employability a pipe dream? I'm going to start with some of the gloom and doom, I'm afraid, to really put this discussion in context. Please bear with me because we will soon move on to the practicalities and perhaps a new rationale for engaging learners in their future lives and work, and for bringing along colleagues and our senior leadership as we move forward. And I'm speaking to you from Curtin University, which is in Perth, Western Australia, where I'm with the Learning Innovation and Teaching Excellence Centre. One of the first things we need to consider is whether students and faculty believe that career development or employability development is important. Let's look at some of the reasons they might actually believe it to be important. I'm going to turn here to the Canvas 2020 Global Research Study and Trends report, which was released just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And look at the very first point here. Career readiness is the #1 priority for students. Very positive. However, look at the language which follows. Matching programs to job demand will continue to increase. Now that's a red flag for me because it's limiting that interest and motivation and perhaps also the learning to the getting of a job at graduate level. The reason it's a red flag is also seen in action here in Australia, for instance, government action, where recently, this is just October the 8th this year, a newspaper article warning that humanities degrees are set to double in price as a result of a new higher education bill. Now, in fact, there were amendments made to that bill, but the situation now, and I'll point out the name of the bill, Job Ready Graduates, it's known as. Here are the results. If you look at the 3 I've highlighted, in agriculture, government contribution of $27,000, the maximum student contribution, $3,950. These are Australian dollars. And if you look down at English and humanities, so if you're going to do anything to do with English, make sure it's English and not within the humanities subjects. There you can see a vast difference based on the perceived value to the economy of those graduates as job-ready graduates. Across all regions, the Canvas report tells us that 3 things are the priorities, the #1 priorities for students. So these are work and career readiness, students' educational goals, and holistic development. We might call them generic capabilities or skills. So self-discipline, communication, knowledge. They include personal reflection in there as well, which is excellent. And these are factors which contribute to student success. Of course they do. This is where metacognition, interest, and vocation collide in higher education, but it's great to see them there. The same report also reports on the impact of COVID, which has negatively affected students' perceptions of their work and career readiness. I'll explain the acronyms in case you're not familiar with them. So APAC is the Asia Pacific, EMEA is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Of course, graduates see all this in the media. They see articles such as Paul Johnson's A Bad Time to Graduate. And we know that they'll be less likely to find work. They'll start off in lower paying occupations, and they'll be more likely to be in part-time and short-term roles rather than perhaps that full-time permanent role they aspire to. Milground, the UK graduate jobs website, reports that just 18% of graduates are securing jobs this year compared to a typical 60%. ZipRecruiter in the US has similarly dire predictions, saying that the number of available jobs popular with university graduates is down 61% on its pre-COVID-19 levels. We know from historic things such as the global financial crisis that leaving education when the economy is weak has a direct impact on employment and pay. Some commentators say for at least 5 years, Others are more dire and put it more like a 40-year impact. And in architecture, there's some compelling evidence that graduating in a depression impacts the entire job life cycle, work life cycle. In these times, safety nets such as that provided by parents are particularly significant. And for those young adults not living with parents, there are lasting impacts on overall income and household spending. This is just one of the very vital equity considerations. And we know, again, from past experience, that a depression or a weak labour market impacts the most disadvantaged students more than their peers. Some of this is not new. I'm going to share some, and I promise I haven't changed a word in this slide, some of the trends reported by organisations such as the ILO, the International Labour Organization, 2 or 3 years ago. So shifting large corporations, there are far more small to medium enterprises now. Workplaces are moving towards virtual space. There's more self-directed work. Work is tending towards more cognitive work than ever before. Organizations are distributed, so you might be working for a large firm, but reporting to several different people in different regions of the world. There are far more flexible patterns of work, and we read, of course, of the increased precarity of work and the dangers of that in terms of rights, worker rights. We see far more multiple concurrent employers and also concurrent clients. Many of our graduates are enforced entrepreneurs. They're needing to be working with clients as much as they are with employers. And finally, and I promise I didn't change this, far more home-based isolated work. COVID, of course, has put this into the spotlight, and the rapidity of change has been unforeseen in 2020. And whilst all that does look pretty dire, there are indeed some real opportunities in there for doing things differently and for enabling work that works around other commitments. If we look back at the GFC and when it first impacted in 2007, you can see here, this is a report from the Australian Government Productivity Commission, the recovery of full-time work amongst young people, which is markedly weaker amongst those with experience. This makes sense from a business perspective. If finances are very tight, you're more likely to employ someone who has a track record. And in a weak labour market, you can often employ those people for less than you would otherwise have to pay them. In reality, though, full-time employment's been on the long-term decline since the 1980s for people aged 20 to 24, and that coincides with the massification of higher education and young people spending far more time in education. And the media reports are everywhere, not just for students, but also for us as a sector. Increasing our concerns, we see casualisation, loss of jobs, and funding increasingly tied to graduate employment, despite ridiculous graduate outcomes metrics, or sometimes, and I'll show later, the metrics not being that bad, but the way they're reported being very simplistic. So why are we concerned? Well, I think aside from all this, we're concerned because we care. We care about the student experience. We care about our graduates. We care about the ability of graduates to make meaningful contributions to society, and we care about the sector. So do students and faculty believe that career development or employability is important? Well, on the surface, yes, absolutely they do. Do they engage in it? Well, this is not a given. And in the remainder of the session, I want to share some of the ways in which we're beginning to change the culture around career development learning, employability, becoming job ready, if you want to call it that, and to suggest ways in which this might be replicated. I also want to put a position that employability is not a bunch of skills that is simply job ready, that employability is far more than that, and in fact is inextricably linked with the purpose of higher education. So let's start with the ubiquitous challenges. Faculty face lack of careers related expertise. We're not trained to be careers practitioners, and actually it can be a scary place if you haven't been in industry for a long time. We don't have time. There's a wonderful word, anaphylsterophobia, which means fear of overcrowding the curriculum, and lack of time is a real concern. We also have lack of resources, ready-made things that we can use with students, knowing that we're scaffolding not only their learning but our own. And the challenges for students are actually quite markedly similar. Lack of career awareness, a lack of time, and a lack of explicit relevance, meaning that students often don't understand the relevance of the tasks we're asking them to do. And perhaps overriding all that, here's the elephant in the room. People don't know what employability is. How many institutions actually have a definition of employability and equate that with the purpose of that institution, the purpose of those programs? Have a look at your own institution, and if there isn't one, try to develop something that puts employability into a different light. So, thank you for bearing with me through some of the doom and gloom. I hope now you can see that there is a way to rethink employability development in higher education, and that's where we're going to turn. I'm going to start with the definition. Employability is the ability to find, create, and sustain meaningful work across the career lifespan and in multiple contexts. This is my definition. You may have your own, and hopefully those definitions you're using take into account the temporal dimension of employability, that it's career long and demands work career long, and also that employability will occur and be learned in multiple contexts as we change jobs, as we change sectors, and as we change careers. And that really is redefining employability so that we distinguish it from employment. Those two terms are often conflated. Let's see it in action now. I'm drawing on Australian GOS data, so graduate destinations data, and this is the way we normally see it in the media. Indeed, this is how students and parents see it. We will get these questions on open days if we're working in the arts or biological sciences in particular. We need to normalise complex work for students. In the GOS data in Australia, as in the UK, if we dig more deeply into the data, we can add, for instance, part-time work. That doesn't mean someone's only working part-time. It might mean they're combining a number of roles in order to create full-time work or the amount of work they wish to do. And then if we add self-employed work to that, you can see all of a sudden a very different picture. So this is not only useful for open days, it's also useful for normalising the complexity of work for students so that they understand that if they don't go out as graduates and get a single full-time job with a single employer, that's not a failure. That in fact is normal. So why do we still report like this? Full-time employment rates. This is the most recent Quilt report on Australian graduates. And just to show you that in context, here's the list of tables and figures in that report. We're still reporting by full-time employment. The next thing then is to challenge the notion that change is new. We're not the first generation whose careers will be disrupted by technology. Far from it, in fact. I like to use ploughs as the example here. You could choose anything, egg cups. It's just really nice to get students and faculty, when we're talking to colleagues, away from the sector. So here are some ploughs from the 17th and 18th century. You can see the hand push, you can see the use of horses, plough horses. Here's a Fordson tractor in 1917. It actually came into being because of the number of male workers who'd gone off to the war effort. But this one, of course, is driven by an Englishman in a three-piece suit, obviously English. Then in the 20th century, here we have a plough, which is far more industrialised, looks as if it's doing a job more efficiently, perhaps, and definitely mechanised again. And in the 21st century, the plough with no cockpit or driver, because it has been pre-programmed. And it's a lovely discussion point to have that kind of slide with students and have them realise the emphasis towards more cognitive tasks in action. So no, change is not new, although COVID has pushed us all. The next thing is to focus on employability rather than employment. So employability doesn't come with your graduation certificate and it has to be worked at. I have students split the word employability, which is, after all, a composite word and fairly recent word as well. These are definitions that students came up with for me to employ, so to pay someone in exchange for work or to make use of. The examples are from students. And again, with examples from students, ability, the means or skill to accomplish a task, a natural or acquired proficiency in a certain field of endeavour. And we might add there that those proficiencies might be transferable to other contexts. It's great to get students to really separate the two facets of employability each time they see them. The next challenge for us, let's say opportunity for us, is to position employability within the higher education space as a metacognitive capacity, as employability thinking. Employability thinking engages students in their cognitive and social development as capable and informed individuals, professionals, and social citizens. I think that this is a great way of positioning employability in line with the purpose of higher education, and really recommend adding the word thinking each time you use the word employability whenever you're trying to get something through at an institutional level. How do we do it though? Really what we need is data-informed action through student-derived data. And student-derived data, as you all know, are notoriously difficult in terms of their reliability. We tend to have broad-scale evaluations of units at the end of units where students know it's too late to benefit them. We tend to have broad-scale surveys where the results of something like a unit of study are withheld until the students have completed the survey. We really needed to rethink student data collection. And so I want to share an example of how we've done that so that it's formative, so that it's done on an annual basis, so that the associated scaffolds are strength-based, and importantly, so that the results are delivered in curriculum. So the first bit is to have students self-assess their perceived employability, and we do that most often as a required reading. And the way in which we ensure that those data have far greater reliability than you would normally get with a broad-scale student survey is that there is a net gain for students. So they get out of it far more than they put in, and I'll show you how that happens in a couple of minutes' time. We then are able to do rapid partnered interventions based on analysis of aggregate data. And that doesn't mean a huge budget. That means that maybe 1 hour of time in a unit is set aside by the unit coordinator and the lecturers and the careers practitioner to look at where students are most and least confident. That business intelligence can then be employed for curricular review and also for longitudinal analysis. And that should enable us to start to look at predictive measures of attrition, for instance, and course switching. The linked data, where we link the tool data with institutional data sets, can be employed for student supports, reporting and retention. And of course, then stemming from that is a myriad, a raft of research and scholarship activities, and that works across portfolios and also across multiple institutions. Sounds complicated, but it was done with a very minimal budget, and I think that the way in which we've done it is scalable. We have 54 institutions doing at least part of this process now. Here's what it looks like for students, none of that complexity. What we've developed for students is, they called it themselves, a student starter kit, where they create a personalised employability profile. that net gain I mentioned earlier is that in 20 minutes of commitment each year, they produce an annual personalised profile. They access a toolkit of resources, which we refresh as often as we can, and they have greater awareness of the available supports. So from a Curtin University perspective, the distinctive experience for Curtin is linking with careers resources, and I'll show you an example of that. So in summary, really, this is a strategy that engages faculty and students as a whole of organisational employability initiative. It requires commitment. We've reviewed things such as our imagery, how we're looking at success and how we're portraying success to students. We map the curriculum. We look for touch points for employability. That might be reflection or an industry placement or an event. And we're starting to turn assessments outwards towards career and society, so that in my utopia, no assessment item is ever read only by the student who wrote it and the person who marks it. And in terms of engagement, we're embedding career thinking across our programs and starting to embed those resources. And you can see here for students, very simple, their 20-minute commitment where they create that profile. They use that profile to enhance their employability and to have more control or agency, and they access the resources as and when they need them. Here's an excerpt from the report. You can see here some advice on how to use the profile report. And what we can do from an institutional perspective is to start linking with what might make that experience distinctive. So for our Curtin students, we have mapped the employability tool elements with the careers and leadership team and other extracurricular initiatives across the university, and students are given that mapping report as they receive their report at Curtin. So they get two things at the same time, and if they click on any one of those, they're linked to the programme which is specific to them at the university. Something that's really important is to enable students to assess and view their confidence, so their perceived employability, and to begin to unpack that in a scaffolded way. And our hope is that that leads more students to go and seek advice early in their studies. From a student perspective, they have 6 literacies, very simple format. But as I'll show you in a couple of slides' time, in fact, the data set is more complex than that. And here's an example of, again, within the report, where a student can click on any one of those links and go straight to their student starter kit. And we see that actually trending now as we get towards the end of academic year, where we see more of the functional employability tools such as cover letters and CVs, but really rethought, very not traditional resources for those things. And then we see study skills and resilience resources being grabbed mid-semester. Those annual self-assessments in a more complex view give us 16 different constructs of career. And for those of you in careers fields, this is a measure based on social cognitive careers theory, and that is a validated measure. These are the things we look at. When we want to make employability explicit, we don't have to change the curriculum. I love curricular change. It's like nothing better than someone to tell me they've got a review coming up. But actually, we can just look at what's existing and use those tasks as employability touch points. So here's an example of a reflection in a unit, given all of 0%. I never worked that one out. And what we did for those students who were first years was to upload to our LMS an educator guide and a student resource on critical reflection, so that we could scaffold that reflective task for students and also give them access to a number of different ways of reflecting. But importantly, we positioned reflection as a professional capability, something that was going to help them get through both their studies and their careers. You'll see here some text in the purple box, and that's the open response that a student typed within their tool. So we take those open text responses and populate them in the tool so that they make easy go-tos for curriculum if we want to have students reflect on their development. What we realised very early on in this process was that it wasn't enough to give an anonymised aggregate data set to educators. They don't have time to look at it. Even careers practitioners struggle to find the time to look at them. So what we did was to create an educator report so that if an educator registers a class to do the tool, then within 3 weeks we create a report with the highlights. And that's been really useful in terms of just-in-time interventions in the class. I know some educators have done something as simple as share this report with students and have a 10-minute conversation. At least it's becoming explicit. In other cases, we have units where there is time to actually start to focus on some of these things. Here's a real example. It was from a Curtin cohort of very high achieving students, in fact, student tutors. And you can see their academic self-efficacy down at the bottom there, very high, as is their career exploration and awareness, as is their occupational mobility. What really struck us was that their emotional intelligence, perceived programme relevance and self-esteem were rock bottom. Now, they came from different disciplines, so when we had a workshop with them at the beginning of October this year, I focused on unpacking emotional intelligence and self-esteem. Those were the things they told us they were least confident with. So rather than doing something generic, we really unpacked those concepts and explored where that lack of confidence came from and what types of things they might want to do. I'd like to end with a few snapshots from the data that we're getting from the initiative. Remember, it's a shared initiative, anybody can use it. And we've got 36,000 students' responses in the database at the moment. Students decide whether or not to include their responses for the research side of the initiative. Here we can see from multiple institutions about 12,000 business students, and we can see that their confidence by year of study declines in all those aspects of employability. The only thing that goes up, in fact, is course commitment, which is telling us that once they get to a certain stage, they're unlikely to change. And that worried us, of course, and we started to wonder whether, in fact, there is a second year slump at play here. We know that in first year we arrive very bright-eyed and perhaps unrealistic, thinking that as long as we pass everything, we'll get the job of our dreams. Excuse me. And that by second year, there's definitely a reality check. But still, these data are telling us there's something we might be able to do about that. And then we ran some other data across all disciplines, and there it is. There's your second year slump in action. And the purple line you can see that's going up, the opposite direction to everything else, again, is the reconsideration of programme. We're also starting to do some analysis according to gender. I've singled out IT here on the right-hand side. You can see that the differences for females in IT are apparent on numerous measures. This particular bit of analysis is informing the West Australian State Government strategic workforce planning, and it's enabling a stream of research and scholarship activities, some of which are starting to work with second year students to unpack some of those perceived levels of confidence, but relative to academic grade. And finally, in the data slides, beginning to understand students' motivation and intentions. This is just something we haven't started to really dig into yet, but here's the number of years for which STEM students expected to work in their discipline. There's 13,000 of them in this particular study. And you can see that 11.64% of them intend to work in STEM between 0 and 4 years. Now, if we were talking about job ready and a linear pathway to work, that would be very concerning. I suspect there's all kinds of other things going on there and hope to be able to share those with you at a future date. So to close, I think that the need for embedding employability is a shared one, and I also firmly believe that the solutions can also be shared. We've developed a student site dedicated to students. We've developed an educator site dedicated to educators with resources which scaffold their learning. We've also created and continue to create partnerships for research and scholarship with universities around the world. In fact, any post-secondary institution around the world. And of course, we're publishing. The big thing is that everything we do is shared by Creative Commons, and it could be that someone listening to this keynote has been one of the contributors to those resources. So yes, embedding employability is both achievable and core business to higher education. We need to create data-driven whole of institution strategies, but they can be done with very minimal budget. In fact, I would argue that the benefits of creating that business intelligence far outweigh the costs of implementing the strategy. We place employability thinking at the centre of the curriculum. That doesn't mean we have to talk about being job ready all the time, but it's about developing students' metacognitive capacities. Engagement is compulsory because it's core to everything we do, but there has to be a net gain for all participants. We have to move away from those broad-scale surveys, which give very little gain for participants. Changing the language is an ongoing challenge. Replacing the word job with work is such a simple thing, and then means that students in all disciplines can relate to the messages we're giving. We engage faculty who are under immense stress at the moment through opportunities for scholarship of teaching and learning, for research. We need to align that engagement with advancement, rewards and recognition, and also we need to support them. We need to communicate that employability development is a lifelong construct in which both students and faculty are engaged. And it's really important that we start to redefine success amongst our student body. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry that we were not able to have a very interactive half hour, but I hope that what I've said is useful, and I really look forward to our Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, Dawn. Thank you for that keynote. It was fascinating, and I think people will probably now know the definition of the word, which I'm not going to pronounce, but maybe you would like to.
Anapholsterophobia, that's the one.
Yeah, that's good. I wrote that down, but I thought I'm not going to try that online. I don't think that will go down well. So thank you for that. We've lots of questions in the chat, and I'll probably just pick as many of them as I can as we go through our session, because there's certainly quite a lot of things that you've talked about that people would like to hear a little bit more about as well, and then some other questions where people are kind of challenging some of the thinking and some of the definitions around the words that you've used. So I'm going to kick that off and start with you. You talked about the terminology. You talked about that just near the end there, using the term work instead of job, and I really like that in your definition. But what I did want to ask was, you're still using the word employability. So the word employability, I guess, has been quite problematic since we first started using it. And one of the kind of popular questions in the Q&A is that there have been changes in how we talk about employability and graduate skills, and these seem to kind of wax and wane with kind of trends and over the years. And so the question is it still a useful word, given it's the elephant in the room? And I loved your picture of the elephant in the room.
That's a great question. Yeah, no, it's a horrible word actually, and it's quite a recent word. It's like career is only 200 years old, but it is the word that brings us together for that common conversation. And until we can move past it, I think it's the word that can enable us to create action. It's also a word that is very popular amongst funding bodies and governments. And often is the word that you need to have in titles in order to get that grant, and that grant is how you fund the real work. So no, it's an awful word, but I think given that we really are stuck with that word, at least for the time being, if we can start to have students unpack it and always split it in half and really think about employability in a very different way, then actually we can make good use of it.
Yeah, I really liked that you used your students to unpack the word. And that's something I think is interesting for people to think about with their own students, because I think it doesn't really matter if they use your definition or if they take the word and use it with their students to try and unpack it a little bit. I think that's a good way to start the debate, actually. So I really like that. I'd like to try that with some students here. One of the other things that was really quite interesting to me, I'm interested in employability and assessment, was about, you mentioned using assessment tasks as touch points, and that in your utopia, no assessment would ever only be seen by a teacher and a student. Can you say a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, I have lots of utopias. In reality, I try to find a touch point in every unit, and that's going to be something, it's a task, it's often assessed, but it's a task which students, which is actually very useful in terms of how we learn and how we negotiate career. And yet students, we know from our research, don't understand the relevance of that. So a great example is team-based assignments, which students hate universally because of all the problems with it. So we have a couple of team-based resources, and what we do is we just flip the language from the group assignment to a professional team, and we explain to students at the start of that task, the reason we ask you to do team-based assignments is because it enables you to develop those professional team working capabilities. We might, if we're in a particular discipline, show where that appears in the accreditation language, or perhaps in some job advertisements. And we get students to understand that this is a really important skill set or capability for them to learn. Similarly, with the conflict that arises in teams, we've got resources on how to resolve team conflict. And so students start to realize that team-based assignment isn't, as they will suggest, because we want to do less marking. It's actually because it's a really important skill. So that's an example of a touch point, but I do that with everything from reflection to feedback, how to give and receive effective feedback. So there's always a touch point in there. And I guess the point about only being seen by the student and the lecturer, that particularly goes to final year, which is where I'm trying to push within our capstone units, our final year units. That's where we start this, is to say, really, is there ever an assignment that should only be read by two people? I don't think there is. I think even if we were looking at an essay, for instance, students really should be challenged to submit the essay, but also to submit a short version of that, which could distill the key points into another format as appropriate to the discipline. If it's a piece of assessment, I'm getting utopian here, that when I give them that feedback, because they understand the value of it, and because they're creating not a piece of assessment that they'll never read again, but a professional artifact, they might actually read the feedback I've given them and enact it in their piece of work, and then upload the final piece of work as a professional artifact. And we are seeing that happen. So I have hope.
It's really interesting, and thinking about doing the assessment and then having different versions of it and different lengths. We sometimes do that QAA actually when we do our reports. We think about that's the long report for the people that like all the research and they like all the references. But what's the kind of quick key points that people can pick up if they're busy? And then how would we then think about that for students or different audiences? So I think doing that with the students rather than just doing a kind of traditional assignment it is a really valuable thing, because you often have to do that in the workplace, because you can't just do your one perfect thing and then that's exactly the only thing you do with it.
But you're having to translate to multiple audiences, and that's, as you say, that you're modelling that at QAA. It's great for students to see that in action.
Yeah, related to the assessment point there, and it might be the same thing, but the question was about, you mentioned the outward assessments approach. Is that the same thing or is that something different?
Yeah, look, it's the same thing. And if anybody really wants to hear someone talk very eloquently about assessment, it would be David Boud here in Australia, who's well known in the UK. And really, the point is that assessment should promote student learning. That's the role of assessment. And yet it's very often quite legitimately aligned with certification. And really, we don't want that to happen, because that undermines the whole educational process. So what we really want to do is to align the assessment piece so that it promotes student learning, and align it so that its focus is beyond the duration of the course. This is pure David Boud speaking here, so that the usefulness of that piece of assessment is made explicit to the students, so they understand that it's not just a thing I've got to get done in the next 3 weeks, it's actually something that I will make use of in the future.
Mm-hmm. So let me pose a question to you. That's my question. I will go back to the questions on the board too. So at Curtin, it's compulsory. So embedding employability is compulsory. So if you are a teacher or an educator, do you have to put that in your assessment if you're thinking about employability in the longer term, and the assessment is for learning? Is that where you should be putting it, or are you? How are you doing it?
It's a great question. And we've rolled out to the first year. We would have gone through the entire second year this year, but COVID intervened. So we're essentially first and third year mostly, but all the first year population create a profile. It's often the self-assessment tool is often positioned as a required reading, and students like that. So we say in week 3, for instance, rather than reading something, you're going to create something. And then we create the educator report. That's always done for anyone, not just at Curtin, within 3 weeks, and goes to the unit coordinator and the lecturer, whoever our contacts are. And at Curtin, our careers practitioners get a copy so that they can see where the students are thinking. Now, in terms of the research, this is really important, and I don't think I said this earlier. Students say whether or not they want their response data in the tool to be included in our research data set. So initially it is purely a teaching and learning tool, and we use the results of the self-assessment tool with each cohort to scaffold their learning so that we can understand where their needs might be. If they opt into including their response in the research set, which I'm surprised almost all students do, then we can use that at a very anonymized level to understand how that plays out in greater numbers. We have 5 institutions which have now linked within our institutional data and our graduate outcomes data. So we're starting to now see some longitudinal trends, and we're able to look now at the confidence of students relative to, for instance, academic performance. So are girls and boys more or less confident in chemistry relative to academic grade? Or we could look at first in family, first generation students. So the equity research is really just starting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we would like to be kept up to date with that. Will that be on your website or will you be publishing that in a paper? Is that the...
Yeah, I'm really interested in anybody who wants to join in. There's more data than I could ever manage. So we have lots of researchers, mostly unfunded, but sometimes with some funding, looking at different aspects of the data, trying things out with students, reporting on the impact of that, and developing resources. And it really is just a community-based initiative in that sense. Yeah, and there's lots of papers coming out. We can't really keep up, which is a lovely position to be in.
Yeah, I think lots of our audience will be interested in maybe contacting you to be part of that, and certainly in our new enhancement theme, resilient learning communities. I think that's something that we want to kind of pick up and look at in terms of equality and diversity and equity. It's one of the things that we're interested in looking at in more detail. I'm going to turn back to the Q&A now, and we're just wondering what has been the feedback from staff and students who've used the approach, and I'm going to add a bit on. And what about the staff and students who haven't used the approach? Yeah,
I used to think that there was about a 30-30 30 divide academics who are already doing this work. But as I was initially, because I realized it was important, I did a music degree. So it's really important to broach these subjects with students, with music students. Then 30% who would like to do it but don't know how, and 30% who say, I forget it, that's not my job. I actually think there's a lot less than 30% in the not my job category now. I think things are changing. So with the people who do it, how do we support them? Well, we make it really simple. We have a little registration that takes less than 2 minutes. We have an intro video that we use to introduce it to students. We have a button that we stick in a learning management LMS so that students can access everything easily. And we use plain English for lecturers. The reaction amongst lecturing staff, well, actually, let me pick on someone who would have been in the category of, oh, do I have to do this? Who is a terrific first year lecturer, but was told that this was now happening. Didn't have any choice in it. Put the tool in as a required reading. This lecturer is so excited. He keeps emailing student comments and tells me how the students have suddenly, particularly in those great big foundation first year units where they're learning such generic information and they can be really quite negative about, I really didn't want to know this. You know, I came to study this subject and I'm having to learn all this stuff and I don't know why it's relevant. And he said just he's got really into making sure that the relevance is explicit, and there's a couple of thousand students in this unit, so it's a big unit. He now then about last year he decided he was going to align it with assessment. So in the reflection at the end of unit there was a reflective task, and he changed it just slightly and asked the students to take one of the things from the report that really made them think and reflect on that and what they're doing about it. And he used the critical reflection tool from the toolkit. Next year, he's got so many plans. He's now finding the touch point in every task, learning task across the unit. He's making it all very explicit to students. There's a team-based assignment in there. There's a reflection. There's an industry visit where students will have to create a ticket with the 3 questions, the 3 things they most want to know. And he's embedding all that just through the unit. There's been no curricular change at all, but he's starting to flip it all out and to make that relevant to students. So he's a good example of someone who didn't come asking, can I do this? It was mandated, but he said it's transformed his students' engagement in that learning.
Yeah, that's great. Related to that, I was interested in, at the very beginning of your presentation, you had that chart about the kind of value of degrees and the proportion of government funding for each discipline depending on its value. So at Curtin, so you're doing all of this good work with your staff and students, and it kind of doesn't sit alongside that government funding and valuing of degrees based on, how did they get to those figures of funding? That's one of my questions. And how can you at Curtin influence the government approach based on the work that you're doing?
They're good questions, and Australians listening, I don't have the answers really. I mean, really the rationale behind the differentiated fee structure for different programs is that it will encourage more students to study in certain fields where there are more job opportunities. Yeah. How that works when we know that people change careers multiple times, may not work in their sector, may transfer their skills immediately to another sector, and where of course there's a cycle of where the job opportunities lie, which may have changed by the time a first year student graduates. Goodness knows, but that was the rationale for it. How do we advocate for a different view? It's the same thing in the UK. I think we have to do it collectively. It really has to be a collective voice, and we have to somehow create the evidence from students and also from graduates, which is why I'm excited to be linking now with the graduate outcomes data, where we can genuinely say where students are going post-degree, and we can start to redefine both attrition and graduate outcomes. We tend to follow quite a lot of what the UK implements, particularly if the UK decided it was a bad idea in Australia. But we have learned some lessons in time not to do them. But I think that kind of neoliberalism and the economization of higher education is there very plainly to see in the way its value is measured. So we need to collectively create very good messaging around the reality, and that means using this kind of data and using it quite strategically and really working very closely together on it. I do have hope.
There's something else you said that's kind of related to that, and it's about kind of value and success. You said that in your practice at Curtin, in terms of looking at employability and how you would embed that, you looked at things like imagery, the imagery that you were using, and how you were portraying success. And I'm interested in a little bit more detail on that.
Maybe I can give you an example from my original discipline, which was music. So I've trained as a classical musician and worked as a classical musician in the UK and Australia. And if you go to a school of music or a conservatoire website and have a look at the images, you'll see a lot of performance. And that's partly because the drive, the motivation, if you like, to choose an institution is often the love of performance. But what it doesn't do is to also show the other things that musicians might do. So that's a good example of the number of different things that a musician might do, and also the changing different motivations of students who might enroll in a music degree, and looking at, so the challenge is, I guess, open your website, look at the homepage, and 3 clicks from the homepage to look at what messages are being given. Look at the open day and future students' promotional materials for the program, and have a look to see what kinds of images are on there, and then ask yourself where they came from. Right, we've done that, and we've done that at a few institutions now, and they tend to come from the marketing department. So they tend to be kind of post-added to the materials that we create for that market, and it's not a kind of internal decision. So it's actually quite easy to start changing the images, because we're also active on social media. We can have different images on things we control, Twitter, Facebook, other social media, on materials that are shared with students on a day-to-day basis. And then the longer term view is to actually work with the marketing department so that we're giving a much broader message. And in fact, when we talk to students about the messaging, they love that broader message, because we can't assume they're all coming to that program to do the one thing.
Yeah, thank you for that. Got an interesting question that popped up in the chat. Could you speak about links to PhD students' employability?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's a space that I would really like to move into, and I know that there are discussions there, as there are here, about how we develop career pathways for our high degree by research students. It's another one where the imagery and the marketing is so one-sided. The assumption that everybody who does a PhD wants to be an academic, it's really not the case at all. And so, I mean, I try at the individual level. If I work with high degree by research students, and they say, can you come and talk about, careers? I'll start with who wants to be an academic, and what else do you want to do? And then broaden it out. But the rhetoric isn't there yet. I individually speak to PhD students and masters and honours students in a really inclusive way. And there are, I know there as well, some really wonderful initiatives and programmes now, which might include industry-based PhDs and all kinds of things that are really focused on things other than academe. But by and large, that language still has to change. I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a solution there, no. But it's a challenge we could maybe communicate about and start. Maybe the challenge for us all listening is we create a a toolkit of resources specifically for PhD students, and I'd be absolutely keen to host and contribute to that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think it's quite easy when you're thinking about employability just to think about the undergraduates. We had a question on the board which was about how is employability delivered across a curriculum when you're dealing with individual students' self-assessment and reflection. That ties into the PhD thing, I think, because you were saying there that you kind of talk to them on an individual basis. So it's quite hard, the individual versus the embedding across the institution, isn't it?
It kind of is and kind of isn't. I think, you know, we've got 58,000 students at Curtin, and there's 54 institutions using this across the world. We don't talk to them all individually, but what we do is that they get that individual report, which is unpacked in a very plain way, a very easy way, and we point them in that report to the supports and the one-on-one supports that are available at most institutions. So we point them, for instance, to a careers service or to a counselling service. We suggest significant others that they might go and talk to answer their queries. We talk to them, we point to free resources. So we're starting to develop that agency. And this isn't a spoon-fed issue, it's a partnership. Students have to develop employability in partnership with us. If they just sit back and wait, as we all know, they're the ones in their final semester who are in panic mode. So it's really important to engage them as participants. I say to students, if I can get hold of them in first year, in preferably at their induction, you know, their very first day on campus, I say, this is the first day of your career. You'll be with us for 3, 4, 5 years. Make the most of it. What kinds of opportunities can you get? And I suggest to program leads that we flip the language so that instead of being a physio student, they're a student physiotherapist, they're a student musician, they're a student mathematician. Business is a bit hard because the noun's complex, but if there's a noun you can use that you actually start to really think that you've got, put the word student first. And that puts their professional hat on and gets them to think about what they can do about it. So it's partly developing agency, it's about making the importance of these activities explicit, and it's about ensuring that students know how to connect with that one-on-one support they might need.
Thank you. We've got about another 5 minutes. We've got a couple of comments on the board and another couple of questions. So I guess I'll just kind of throw the comments out there and then maybe kind of go to some of the questions. So somebody has commented that they think the NSS in the UK is problematic and the universities are too focused on the results of those. And there's also another comment about the streaming of graduates by their classification is divisive. So many will not apply for PG study or employment because they don't have the 2-1 or the first. I guess that's a bit about that confidence issue, and about, you know, feeling that you're not having the parity of opportunity with those students that are maybe getting those higher classifications.
These are such great questions. The NSS, we have a similar one, although I think your response rates are higher than ours. I don't know the NSS survey item by item, but I suspect there's some really good questions in there that are very rarely reported. So if we could get hold of those data and actually start to look in more depth at them, that would be good. We could also look at whether, and I apologise if this already exists, but in Australia, the graduate survey instrument, universities can add their own questions to those specific questions. Collectively, I'd like to see an employability pod of questions and actually have those as standard. And certainly in Australia, there's openness to doing that. So maybe we need to decide what questions we want and make sure they're in there, and also make sure that we have access to the data, which I know is sometimes problematic. I've forgotten the other bit. Sorry, Deborah. What was the
other bit? Was about the confidence. You know, if you've not got the 2-1 or the first.
And that comes back to equity in a way, doesn't it? We've just done some research looking at the differences in student confidence between students from low SES backgrounds and their peers. And one of the biggest differences was academic self-efficacy. So that's my confidence that I can complete my programs or pass my units at the first attempt. It was significantly less amongst those students. So they kind of go in with that less confidence, and that's relative to academic grade. So they're underconfident, and we need to be aware of that. I think confidence also, we scaffold so well in first year, confidence in the general student population slides in second year, when I remember second year thinking, my goodness, this will never end. You know, it's very content heavy and so on in second year. So all the usual things, but again, an equity issue. And then really thinking about how that self-efficacy translates into resilience if I get a 2-1. Because the reality is, if I am a high socioeconomic student with an awful lot of social capital around me and I get a 2-1, I am very likely to go and see someone and say, look, I got a 2-1, but this is where I want to be. What are my alternative pathways? And if I am not that person, I'm a lot less likely to do that.
Thank you. I'm just gonna, we're kind of running out of time, which is a shame. There's a really nice comment in the chat box about one of the issues being that the additional ability developed by PhD students is not always recognised outside of academia. So I guess it's a bit about marketing those skills and how you present those to the outside world.
Yeah, I'd argue that that's the case for all students, actually. That one of the big bits about employability and the way we define it is that students need to become aware of their skills and their areas in need of development. We try not to use the weakness word. And also they need to learn how to articulate those. So that's about understanding as a whole person, not just what they've learned at our universities, what kinds of skills and capabilities they bring to a situation. And that may not be from work, it may be from parenting, it may be from working at Burger King, it may be from volunteer work or stuff that they're doing with a local sports team. They don't actually recognise that these are valued skills. And they also continue to believe the myth that employers are looking at GPA. With very few exceptions, employers don't look at GPA. They take the degree as a given and they ask, they differentiate when the recruiters will tell us this all the time, they differentiate the applicants by what they've done beyond their degree. Now, there is an equity issue here, because if you're relying on volunteerism, for instance, if you're a student with a lot of family support, you're more likely to be able to do volunteer activities than somebody who's working 3 jobs and you know, managing life. But at the same time, those students often have a very rich life experience and they need to learn how to articulate it. So we have quite a few resources on that, because it's a massive issue. Really getting students to recognise. I think one of my favourite resources is called What Do You Know Already? And it's popular because it's useful.
Thank you. I think I'm going to finish the Q&A session there. We do have a few questions left on the board. We could maybe pop them into some of our conference forum material if anyone would like to kind of continue with those discussions. But in the meantime, it falls to me to say thank you for your presentation, Dawn, and for your conversation there. It was an absolute privilege to speak to you this morning. And I think we've learned lots, we've thought lots, and we've got some good resources to take away. So I don't think we can ask any more of a session than that. And I think certainly some people will want to be in touch with you with your kind offer of getting involved in the work. Certainly that's a very exciting prospect.